In 1279, the last ships of the Song court burned on the southern sea, and an emperor vanished with his officials into the waves. It was a turning point for medieval China, a wealthy, highly organized civilization, because a foreign conqueror now claimed the Middle Kingdom, and the rules of power in East Asia changed overnight. This video follows roughly 1,000 years, from the Tang reunification in the 600s to the Ming collapse in the 1600s, a cycle of unity, brilliance, breakdown, conquest, and recovery. China built huge cities, deep markets, and a merit-based bureaucracy that could mobilize people and grain at an incredible scale. But the catch was that the very system that created order could also turn rigid, and the wealth that flowed south could make the heartland safer while leaving the frontiers exposed. How did a civilization that often led the world in administration and technology keep being shaken by rebels and outsiders? The answers sit in the choices each dynasty made to survive. China's greatest strength in this era was also its most dangerous gamble. It trusted the frontier to protect the heart. In the early 600s, the Tang dynasty reunited China from a capital at Chang'an, rebuilding roads, taxes, and a professional state after centuries of division. Prosperity followed, powered by stable grain shipments, expanding farmland, and trade that tied markets together across long distances. Success pulled the empire outward, so the court relied on powerful border commanders to fight and police the edges of the world. But the catch was that those commanders became states within the state. In 755, the general An Lushan turned his armies inward, and the rebellion shattered the Tang's finances, population, and authority. The dynasty survived, but it ruled by bargaining with warlords and watching provinces harden into semi-independent zones. The center still looked strong until the next crisis arrived to finish what the rebellion began. The Tang did not fall in one dramatic battle. It bled out through loss of control. By the late 800s, the empire still had an emperor, but real power shifted to regional strongmen who kept taxes, raised armies, and treated appointments like property. Droughts, corruption, and harsh levies pushed rural families to the edge, and the countryside became the fuel for rebellion. The most famous was Huang Chao, whose uprising ripped through the late Tang world and even seized Chang'an, proving the court could no longer protect its own capital. But the catch was that crushing revolts often strengthened the very warlords the dynasty feared, because generals who saved the throne demanded autonomy as payment. When the Tang finally collapsed in 907, China's north fractured into short-lived regimes, while the south, richer and less exposed, kept growing in trade, cities, and rice farming. The balance of China was shifting southward, and that shift would shape the next dynasty's greatest challenge: how to reunite without letting generals take the state hostage again. The Song dynasty built a powerhouse economy, and then had to pay to keep it alive. In 960, the Song reunited much of China from Kaifeng, determined to prevent another age of warlords by keeping generals under tight civilian control. The result was a government that could tax, register, and administer with rare efficiency, while cities expanded and markets deepened. New rice strains and southern development made food more reliable, and commerce tied the empire together with paper money, shipping, and booming urban life. But the catch was that weakening independent generals also meant a weaker army at the borders. Powerful neighbors rose on the steppe and in the northeast, and the Song faced the Liao and later the Jin, often choosing diplomacy and tribute because defeat would risk the entire system. So the Song grew richer even as it lost strategic ground. When the Jin struck hard, the north cracked, the court fled south, and China's political center followed its wealth down the rivers toward the coast, where the next phase would test whether prosperity could substitute for security. The dynasty survived by running south, and in doing so, it remade what China looked like. After 1127, the southern Song rebuilt its court at Hangzhou, leaning on river transport, sea trade, and dense southern farms to replace the lost northern plains. Merchants, shipyards, and tax offices turned coastal cities into engines of cash, and the state learned to feed armies by moving grain like a business. That wealth funded strong defenses along the border, while new weapons and fortifications raised the cost of invasion. But the catch was that prosperity could not reclaim the north, and the Song now lived next to hardened enemies who wanted the same resources. Could trade and ships stop a land empire forever? The pressure grew as steppe warfare evolved, and northern rivals fought for supremacy, turning the frontier into a long, exhausting contest. The Song held on until a new force began stitching the grasslands together, and the balance of power tilted toward conquest. The frontier that once guarded China now produced the empire that would rule it. In the early 1200s, the Mongols unified the steppe under Genghis Khan and turned mobility into a machine for war and tribute. Their advantage was not just speed, but organization, disciplined units, strict command, and the ability to pull craftsmen and supplies into a growing campaign system. Northern China's divided defenses and rival courts gave the invaders openings, and once cities fell, the conquerors learned to use Chinese tax methods to fund the next push. But the catch was that conquering China required more than winning battles. It required ruling farmers, officials, and walled cities at massive scale. So the Mongols adapted, mixing intimidation with administration, and each victory widened the gap between the secure south and the exposed north. The Southern Song watched the northern world collapse, buying time with rivers and forts. But time was running out, because the new conquerors were now learning how to fight a rich dynasty that refused to break. The Song did not fall quickly. It was worn down by a conqueror that learned patience. In 1271, Kublai Khan declared the Yuan dynasty and made China the core of a wider Mongol world, using Chinese-style ministries, taxes, and records to extract steady revenue. When the Southern Song finally collapsed in 1279, the Yuan ruled a reunited China and tied it to long-distance routes that moved goods, people, and ideas across Eurasia. For a moment, the empire looked unstoppable, a strong court, big cities, and trade networks that reached farther than ever. But the catch was that conquering elites and settled society pulled in opposite directions. Heavy spending, court factionalism, and a rigid social hierarchy deepened resentment, while floods and famine exposed how fragile legitimacy could be. Once rebellion began, it spread along the very transport and tax lines that made Yuan rule possible. The dynasty system was powerful until its own infrastructure became a highway for revolt, and a new Chinese-led regime rose from the chaos.
The Ming rebuilt China with a simple message: no more outsiders, no more warlords, no more uncertainty.
In 1368, the rebellion leaders Yu Yanzong drove the Yuan north and founded the Yuan dynasty, restoring Chinese rule and recentering authority through strict law, land registries, and disciplined taxation. The state pushed farming recovery, repaired canals, and demanded obedience from officials through intense oversight. This created a strong base, predictable revenue, a revived countryside, and a court that could mobilize labor and grain.
But the catch was that fear-based control came with long-term costs. Suspicion bred purges, bureaucracy became cautious, and power gathered around the emperor's household and palace system, especially as later rulers leaned on eunuch networks to bypass officials. The Ming looked stable, but its stability depended on constant management and a delicate balance between the court and the provinces. As the dynasty expanded influence outward and rebuilt the frontier, it also set up its next dilemma: how to project strength without draining the system that paid for it. The Ming could reach the oceans, and then chose to pull back. In the early 1400s, the court at Nanjing, and later Beijing, sponsored huge voyages led by Zhang He, projecting prestige across the Indian Ocean with fleets that dwarfed most rivals. These missions showcased wealth and organization, linking China to foreign ports through gifts, trade, and diplomacy, and they signaled that the dynasty could control both rivers and seas. But the catch was that spectacle did not solve the dynasty's core security problem: the northern frontier. As threats rebuilt on the steppe, resources shifted to walls, garrisons, and grain supplies for soldiers stationed far from the richest tax base in the south. Officials argued that overseas ventures were expensive distractions, and the state tightened control of maritime activity. The result was a China that remained commercially connected, but increasingly cautious in official policy. The Ming had chosen land defense over ocean ambition, and that decision would matter when money tightened. corruption spread, and the border once again became the empire's most dangerous pressure point. The Ming economy boomed, but the government struggled to turn that wealth into stability. By the 1500s and early 1600s, trade expanded and taxes increasingly hinged on silver, tying state finances to markets and global flows that ordinary farmers could not control. The empire looked prosperous in its cities, yet the countryside felt the weight of fixed tax demands, local corruption, and rising insecurity. Meanwhile, the northern and northeastern frontiers demanded constant spending on troops, fortifications, and supplies, turning defense into a permanent budget crisis. That's when the balance broke. The state's ability to respond to shocks weakened, even as shocks multiplied. Poor harvests, climate strain, and unpaid soldiers made unrest more likely, and court politics turned reforms into faction fights instead of solutions. The Ming still had manpower and tradition, but it was losing confidence and cash at the same time. When large-scale rebellion ignited in the interior, it did not just threaten provinces, it threatened the dynasty's core mechanism, collecting grain and silver on time to keep the state alive. The Ming did not lose because it faced one enemy. It lost because it faced two at once. In the 1630s and 1640s, major uprisings led by Zhang He spread through stressed regions where taxes, famine, and weak local defense had broken trust in the state. As rebel armies moved, officials defected, supply lines snapped, and cities bargained for survival. But the catch was that crushing rebellion required loyal, paid troops, and the treasury was collapsing. In 1644, Li's forces entered Beijing, and the last Ming emperor died as the capital fell, ending a dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries. Yet the story did not end with rebellion. On the northeastern frontier, the Manchus, already organized into a disciplined military state, seized the moment. Ming commanders opened passes, alliances shifted, and the Manchus marched through the same gateways the Ming had spent fortunes defending. China was about to be reunited again, but under a new ruling house, proving the old pattern had returned. When the center weakens, the frontier decides the future.
Medieval China began this thousand-year story as a reunited empire under the Tang, surged into cultural and economic brilliance, then cracked when frontier power turned inward and the center lost control. The Song rebuilt order through administration and markets, but its wealth could not fully shield it from stronger land rivals, and conquest remade the map under the Mongol Yuan. The Ming restored Chinese rule with strict institutions and massive mobilization, yet that same tightly managed system grew brittle under fiscal strain, border war, and internal revolt. The big answer is simple. China endured because its bureaucracy, farming base, and culture could rebuild unity again and again, but it kept being shaken when frontier pressures and internal stress hit at the same time. The open loops pay off here. The system that created stability also became rigid, and the shift of wealth south made the heartland richer while the borders stayed dangerous. Modern China still carries the legacy of these cycles in its administrative traditions, regional economies, and the lasting idea that unity is both a goal and a vulnerability. If you want more X years in 20 minutes timelines, like, subscribe, and tell me what civilization to cover next.